The first gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Nebraska Territory, 1867, and Katherine Greenwood dove behind an overturned wagon, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The second shot splintered wood inches from her face, sending sharp fragments into her cheek. 3 days into her journey toward Scottsbluff, and already the wilderness had proven more treacherous than the life she'd left behind in Philadelphia. Katherine pressed a shaking hand to her bleeding cheek, her fingers coming away crimson. The stage coach that had been carrying her and 6 others lay broken on its side, the driver's body sprawled unnaturally across the ground nearby. Bandits had ambushed them at dawn, ruthless men with faces hidden behind dusty bandanas. Only she had managed to escape the initial slaughter by rolling into the ravine when the coach overturned. "Come on out, lady," a gruff voice called. "Ain't no sense in making this harder than it needs to be." Katherine pressed her back against the wagon, clutching the small Derringer pistol her father had insisted she carry. 2 shots, that was all she had. The jewels sewn into the hem of her dress weighed heavy, her inheritance and her future all stitched into hidden pockets by her lady's maid before she'd left Pennsylvania. All she had left of her family's fortune after her father's creditors had descended like vultures. The sound of boots crunching on gravel grew closer. Katherine closed her eyes, her breath coming in short gasps. This couldn't be the end, not after everything she'd sacrificed to start anew. A third gunshot cracked the morning air, but this one came from a different direction. Then another. And another. Shouts of men, the thundering of hooves, and suddenly the bandits were no longer calling for her but yelling to each other. "It's Vale Cunningham. Get out of here." Katherine remained frozen, unsure if the newcomer presented yet another danger. The gunfire continued for several more seconds before silence fell, broken only by the approach of a single horse. Katherine gripped her Derringer tighter, finger trembling on the trigger. "You can come out now, madam," a deep voice called. "They're gone." Slowly, Katherine peered around the wagon. A tall figure sat atop a magnificent chestnut stallion, the rising sun at his back casting his face in shadow. As he dismounted and stepped forward, she saw a man perhaps 30 years of age with sun-bronzed skin and eyes as deep blue as a summer sky. His dark hair fell just past his collar and a week's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. The star pinned to his leather vest caught the light. "Sheriff Vale Cunningham," he said, holstering his pistol. "Are you hurt?" Katherine stood on unsteady legs, suddenly aware of the tear in her traveling dress and the blood on her cheek. "Katherine Greenwood, and I'm quite all right, thanks to your timely arrival." His eyes took in the carnage around them, his expression grim. "I've been tracking these men for 3 days. I'm sorry I didn't find them before they attacked your coach." He knelt beside the driver, checked for signs of life, then shook his head. "The others, all dead," Katherine whispered, the reality of her situation settling cold in her stomach. "They killed them all for the strongbox." She gestured to where the metal box lay open and empty beside the coach. Vale Cunningham stood, his tall frame blocking the sun. "Where were you headed?" "Scottsbluff," Katherine replied. "My uncle owns property there. I'm to be his housekeeper." The lie came easily. She'd practiced it enough times. In truth, her uncle was merely a business associate of her father's who had offered her a place to stay until she could establish herself. The last thing she needed was for anyone to know about the small fortune hidden in her clothing. The sheriff studied her for a long moment. "Scottsbluff is still 4 days' ride from here, and that's if the weather holds." He glanced at the gathering clouds on the horizon, and the trail ahead crosses Apache territory, been troubles there lately. "I have no choice," Katherine said, squaring her shoulders. "I must reach Scottsbluff before winter." Vale looked at the darkening sky, then back to her determined face. "The trail is too dangerous to cross alone, Miss Greenwood." Katherine lifted her chin. "I am quite capable, then you won't cross alone," he interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "I need to head to Scottsbluff myself to deliver news of these bandits to the territorial marshal stationed there." He whistled, and his horse trotted closer. "We'll bury these poor souls properly, then make camp. We'll start fresh in the morning." As Katherine watched the sheriff gather rocks to mark the graves of the slain passengers, she fought the impulse to refuse his help. Independence had been her mantra since her father's death. But standing alone in the vast wilderness, the bodies of her traveling companions growing cold in the dirt, Katherine realized that pride would not keep her alive in this untamed land. That night, as they sat beside a small fire, Vale passed her a tin cup of coffee. "What brings a lady like yourself out to Nebraska Territory? Truth this time," Katherine stiffened. "I beg your pardon," the sheriff's eyes reflected the firelight. "Your hands are too soft for a housekeeper, and that accent isn't one I've heard from working folk." Katherine considered her options, then decided a partial truth was safest. "My father passed away 6 months ago. There was nothing left for me in Philadelphia. And the uncle in Scottsbluff, a family friend," she admitted. "He's offered me a place to stay until I can establish myself." Vale nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "It's a hard country out here, Miss Greenwood, different from what you're used to." "I'm stronger than I look, Sheriff Cunningham." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I don't doubt that. You'd have to be to survive what happened today." He tossed the dregs of his coffee into the fire. "Get some rest. Dawn comes early, and we've got a long ride ahead." Katherine lay wrapped in the blanket Vale had provided, staring up at stars more brilliant than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia. The sheriff sat with his back against a boulder, rifle across his lap, keeping watch. She studied his profile in the dying firelight, the straight nose, the strong jaw, the alert eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. In the city, she might have found him intimidating. Out here, his vigilance was the only thing standing between her and death. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Katherine felt something other than fear settle in her chest. Perhaps it was gratitude, or perhaps something more complicated that she wasn't ready to name. Whatever it was, it followed her into sleep, where no nightmares came to disturb her rest. Morning arrived with frost coating the ground and Vale already preparing the horses. He'd found a mare among the stagecoach team that had survived the attack, a sturdy bay with kind eyes that nuzzled Katherine's palm when she approached. "She'll carry you well enough," Vale said, adjusting the saddle. "Ever ridden before?" "Yes," Katherine answered. At his raised eyebrow, she added, "In parks, on gentle paths with a side saddle." Vale's laugh was unexpected, a rich sound that transformed his serious face. "Well, Miss Greenwood, I'm afraid we don't have the luxury of a side saddle out here, but Penny here is steady. She'll forgive your mistakes." The first few hours of riding were agony for Katherine. Her thighs burned and her back ached from the unfamiliar posture. Vale set a deliberate pace, not too fast, allowing her to adjust. By midday, she'd found a rhythm that, while not comfortable, was at least manageable. They stopped to water the horses at a small creek, and Katherine gratefully slid from the saddle, wincing as her feet touched the ground. Vale pretended not to notice her discomfort, preserving her dignity in a way that made her oddly grateful. "We'll reach Broken Pine by nightfall," he said, pointing to distant hills. "Small trading post, not much, but they've got beds and hot food." Katherine nodded, stretching her sore muscles. "And after that?" "Another 2 days to Fort Laramie, then 2 more to Scottsbluff if the weather holds." He glanced at her. "The trail gets rougher from here. Apache have been raiding settlements to the north. Cavalry's been sent in, which only makes things worse." "Are they likely to attack us?" Katherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Vale handed her his canteen. "Not if we're careful and respectful. Most attacks happen when settlers encroach on their hunting grounds or the army pushes them too far." He paused. "The real danger is other men, deserters, outlaws, men with nothing to lose." Katherine took a long drink of water. "Like the men who attacked the stagecoach." "Exactly." Vale's expression darkened. "I've been after that particular gang for months. They've hit 3 coaches and 2 homesteads that I know of. And now they're dead," Katherine said quietly. Vale's eyes met hers. 3 of them are. Their leader, a man called Silas Redmond, got away. He's still out there." A chill ran down Katherine's spine despite the warm afternoon sun. "Will he come after us?" "Silas isn't one to forget a slight," Vale said, helping her back onto her horse. But we'll be moving fast, and I know this territory better than he does." As they rode, the landscape changed from open prairie to rolling hills dotted with pine and juniper. Vale pointed out landmarks, teaching her to read the land as they traveled. Katherine found herself fascinated not just by the wild beauty around them, but by the man himself. For all his gruff exterior, Vale Cunningham had a poet's appreciation for the wilderness and a scholar's knowledge of its ways. "How long have you been a sheriff?" she asked as they followed a narrow trail through a stand of cottonwoods. 5 years in Broken Pine," he replied. "Before that, I rode with the Texas Rangers for a spell after the war." "You fought in the war," Vale nodded, his expression shuddering slightly. "Union cavalry. Joined up in '62 when I was 18, saw things no man should see." Katherine recognized the shadow that passed over his face. She'd seen it on her father when he spoke of her mother's death. "My father lost everything in the war," she offered. "He invested heavily in Southern cotton." "Is that why you're heading west? A fresh start?" "Something like that," Katherine said, unconsciously touching the hem of her dress where her jewels were hidden. They reached Broken Pine just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The trading post was little more than a collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered around a dusty central area that could generously be called a street. A few horses stood hitched outside what appeared to be a saloon, and smoke rose from the chimney of a squat building with a faded sign identifying it as Hart's Lodge and Mercantile. Vale dismounted in front of the lodge and helped Katherine down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes and smell the leather and pine scent of him. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Hart runs a clean establishment," he said, leading the horses to a hitching post. "She'll have a hot meal and a bath ready if you want one." The mention of a bath nearly brought tears to Katherine's eyes. "That sounds heavenly." Inside, the lodge was surprisingly cozy. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and rough-hewn tables were scattered throughout the main room. A heavy-set woman with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun looked up from behind a counter when they entered. "Vale Cunningham," she exclaimed, her stern face breaking into a smile. "Been wondering when you'd show your face around here again." Her gaze shifted to Katherine, eyes narrowing slightly. "And who's this?" "Martha, this is Miss Katherine Greenwood," Vale said. "She was the lone survivor of a stagecoach robbery. I'm escorting her to Scottsbluff." Mrs. Hart's expression softened. "Lord have mercy, child." "You've been through an ordeal, haven't you?" She came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, you're safe now. I've got a room upstairs with clean sheets and can have a bath drawn for you straight away." "Thank you," Katherine said, relief washing over her. "That would be wonderful." "And you'll both stay for supper," Mrs. Hart continued, in a tone that brooked no argument. "Got venison stew and fresh bread." The bath, when it came, was in a copper tub behind a screen in her small room. The water was hot, scented with lavender, and Katherine sank into it with a sigh of pure pleasure. She washed away the dust of the trail and the lingering horror of the stagecoach attack, careful to remove the pouch containing her jewels from her dress hem, before soaking the torn garment in cold water to remove the bloodstains. When she emerged downstairs in her spare dress, thankfully packed in the satchel she'd managed to grab during the attack, Vale was seated at a table near the fire, deep in conversation with a lean, weathered man whose buckskins marked him as a trapper or guide. Both men stood as she approached, and Vale pulled out a chair for her. "Miss Greenwood, this is Ezra Blackfoot," Vale said. "He brings news from the north." Ezra nodded to her politely before returning to his conversation with Vale. "Cavalry's pushing them hard, Vale. Chief Red Cloud ain't backing down. Every trail between here and Fort Laramie is being watched." Vale's expression grew troubled. "The Bozeman Trail, especially there. 3 supply wagons hit last week." Ezra lowered his voice. "Word is the Cheyenne are joining with the Lakota. Could be a full-scale uprising by spring." Katherine felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. Vale had mentioned troubles with the Apache, but this sounded far worse. Mrs. Hart arrived with bowls of rich stew and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. As they ate, Vale remained quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he turned to Katherine. "We need to change our plans," he said. "The northern route through Fort Laramie is too dangerous right now." "What are our options?" Katherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Vale unfolded a weathered map on the table between them. "We can head southeast, follow the Platte River. It's longer, adds maybe 3 days to our journey, but it skirts the worst of the conflict areas." Katherine studied the map, tracing the winding line of the river with her finger. "If it's safer, then that's what we should do." "It's not without its own dangers," Vale warned. "The terrain is rougher and there are fewer settlements along the way. We'd be on our own for most of the journey." Their eyes met across the table, and Katherine saw concern in his gaze, not doubt about her abilities, but genuine worry for her safety. It stirred something within her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I trust your judgment, Sheriff," she said softly. A moment of understanding passed between them, and Vale nodded. "We'll leave at first light." That night, as Katherine lay in a real bed for the first time in days, she found sleep elusive. The news of Indian troubles to the north weighed heavily on her mind, as did the knowledge that the outlaw leader, Silas Redmond, remained at large. But most distracting of all was the memory of Vale's eyes in the firelight and the strange fluttering in her chest when he'd helped her from her horse. Katherine had never been one for romantic notions. Her father's business failures had taught her early that practicality trumped passion. Her brief engagement to the son of her father's business partner had been a calculated arrangement, dissolved the moment her father's finances collapsed. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially not now, with her future so uncertain. And yet, as she drifted finally toward sleep, it was Vale's face she saw behind her closed eyelids and Vale's voice that followed her into dreams. Morning came with low, threatening clouds and a damp chill in the air that promised rain before day's end. Katherine dressed quickly in the clothes Mrs. Hart had washed for her, grateful that her traveling dress had been salvageable. The older woman had even mended the tier and reinforced the hidden pocket in the hem where Katherine's jewels now safely resided once more, downstairs. Vale was already at a table with coffee and plates of eggs and bacon. He stood as she approached, and Katherine noted that he'd shaved and his dark hair was damp, as if freshly washed. "You look rested," he said, pulling out her chair. "As do you," she replied, surprising herself with the hint of warmth in her voice. They ate quickly while Vale outlined their route. "We'll follow Raven Creek south until it meets the Platte," he explained. "There's good cover along the way, plenty of water. If we push hard, we can make 15 miles today before the weather turns." Mrs. Hart packed them provisions: smoked venison, hard bread, dried apples, and coffee. As they prepared to leave, she pressed a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth into Katherine's hands. "Extra socks," the older woman said gruffly. "Wool, your city stockings won't last out here." Before Katherine could thank her, Mrs. Hart turned to Vale. "You take care of her, Vale Cunningham. This country's no place for a lady alone." Vale touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, madam." They set out under increasingly threatening skies, the horses moving at a steady pace along the narrow trail that led from Broken Pine toward Raven Creek. Katherine found that her second day in the saddle was easier than the first, her body beginning to adapt to the rhythm of riding astride. "You're a natural," Vale commented as she navigated a tricky section of trail without hesitation. "Most city folk take longer to find their seat." "I've always been a quick study," Katherine replied, pleased by the compliment, "though I suspect I'll be feeling it in my muscles tomorrow." Vale chuckled. "Mrs. Hart slipped some arnica salve into your saddlebag, said you'd need it." They rode in comfortable silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady clop of hooves on the packed dirt trail. Katherine found herself studying Vale's broad shoulders and the confident way he sat his horse, as if he and the animal were one being. "Tell me about Scottsbluff," she said finally, as much to distract herself from her wandering thoughts as to learn about her destination. "What kind of place is it?" Vale considered the question. Growing fast, The Union Pacific's pushing the railroad through, so there's money to be made. It's rough around the edges still, but there are good people there." He glanced back at her. "Your uncle, your father's friend, what's his name?" "Thomas Elliott," Katherine replied. "He owns a dry goods store, I believe." Vale nodded. "I know of him, decent man, fair in his dealings." He paused. "Though I wasn't aware he was looking for a housekeeper." Katherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's not a formal arrangement." "He's merely providing lodging until I can establish myself." "And how do you plan to do that?" Vale asked, curiosity evident in his voice. The question caught Katherine off guard. She'd been so focused on escaping Philadelphia and reaching Scottsbluff that she hadn't given much thought to what would come after. "The jewels would provide capital, but for what? I'm not entirely certain," she admitted. "Perhaps a millinery shop or a dress shop. I have some skill with a needle." Vale smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "Scottsbluff could use both. Nearest dressmaker is in Cheyenne, and the ladies are always complaining about having to send east for proper hats." The first raindrops began to fall, fat and cold, spattering against Katherine's shoulders. Vale pulled up his horse, scanning the horizon. "Storm's coming faster than I thought," he said, frowning at the darkening sky. "There's a line shack about 3 miles ahead. We'll shelter there until it passes." They increased their pace, the horses picking their way carefully along the increasingly muddy trail. The rain intensified, driven by a rising wind that cut through Katherine's cloak like a knife. By the time the small cabin came into view, nestled against a stand of pines, she was soaked to the skin and shivering violently. Vale dismounted quickly, helping Katherine down from her horse. Her legs buckled beneath her, stiff from riding and numb with cold. Without hesitation, Vale swept her into his arms, carrying her the short distance to the cabin door. "I can walk," she protested weakly, even as she instinctively curled closer to his warmth. "Indulge me," Vale said, kicking open the door and ducking to enter the low structure. The interior of the line shack was Spartan but dry. A small iron stove stood in one corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs in another. A narrow cot with a straw mattress occupied the wall opposite the door. Vale set Katherine gently on one of the chairs. "Stay here. I'll see to the horses and bring in our supplies." While he was gone, Katherine hugged herself, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. The cabin was cold, but at least it blocked the wind and rain. When Vale returned, his arms full of their saddlebags, he immediately set to building a fire in the stove. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, not looking at her as he coaxed flames from kindling. "There should be blankets in that trunk by the cot." "I'll step outside while you change." Katherine was too cold to argue. As soon as Vale closed the door behind him, she struggled out of her sodden dress and petticoats, hanging them near the stove, which was already beginning to radiate blessed heat. In the trunk, she found rough wool blankets that smelled of pine and wood smoke. She wrapped one around herself like a shawl over her chemise and drawers, which were merely damp rather than soaking. "You can come in," she called, her voice still unsteady from shivering. Vale entered, his own clothes dripping. He carried an armful of firewood which he stacked beside the stove. "Storms settled in for the duration," he reported. "Might as well make ourselves comfortable. We won't be traveling again today." As he spoke, he removed his sodden coat and vest, hanging them beside Katherine's dress. His shirt clung to his broad shoulders, and Katherine found herself staring before catching herself and quickly looking away. "There's coffee in my saddlebag," Vale said, either not noticing her gaze or politely ignoring it. "And some of Mrs. Hart's venison, not the dinner I planned, but it'll do." They worked together to prepare a simple meal, the small cabin gradually warming as the stove heated. Vale hung a pot of water to boil, then surprised Katherine by producing a deck of playing cards from his saddlebag. "Know how to play poker?" he asked, shuffling the cards with practiced ease. Katherine smiled. "My father taught me, though he always said it wasn't ladylike to admit it." Vale's answering grin was boyish, softening the hard lines of his face. "Your father sounds like a man of contradictions." "He was," Katherine said, accepting the cards Vale dealt her. brilliant with numbers, hopeless with money. He could calculate complex shipping routes in his head, but couldn't remember to wear matching socks. The memory brought a pang of grief, but also a fondness that had been absent in the difficult months after his death. They played cards as the rain drummed on the roof, sharing the simple meal and stories of their pasts. Katherine learned that Vale had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith. He'd fought at Antietam and Gettysburg, experiences he described in sparse, careful terms that told Katherine more by what he omitted than by what he said. After the war, unable to face returning home to a town where too many young men hadn't come back, he drifted west. "The badge wasn't my idea," he admitted, studying his cards. "I broke up a fight in a saloon in Broken Pine. Next morning, the town council offered me the job. And you took it," Katherine observed. Vale shrugged. "Seemed as good a direction as any. 5 years later, here I am." He laid down his cards, 3 queens. Katherine revealed her hand with a small smile. "Full house." Vale laughed, gathering the cards to shuffle again. "Your father taught you well." As darkness fell outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. Wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the single window. Katherine found herself grateful for the solid walls and warm fire, and for Vale's steady presence across the small table. "What happened to your dress?" Vale asked suddenly, gesturing to the mended tear in the fabric where it hung near the stove. "That wasn't from the stagecoach attack, was it?" Katherine tensed, her hand instinctively moving toward her chemise, where she'd pinned the pouch containing her jewels. "It caught on a nail in the coach," she lied, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Vale's gaze was penetrating, but he didn't challenge her. Instead, he dealt another hand of cards. "Your uncle in Scottsbluff, will he be expecting you on a certain day?" "No," Katherine replied, relieved by the change of subject. "He knows only that I was to arrive sometime this month." Vale nodded. "Good. With this weather and the change of route, we're looking at another 5 or 6 days on the trail." The thought of 5 more days alone with Vale Cunningham sent an unexpected thrill through Katherine. She told herself it was merely relief at having a capable guide, but a deeper part of her recognized the growing attraction she felt toward the sheriff. As the evening wore on, Vale insisted Katherine take the cot while he would sleep on the floor near the stove. She protested, but he was adamant. "I've slept on worse," he assured her. During the war, a wooden floor and a wool blanket would have been luxury. Katherine relented, settling onto the narrow cot as Vale banked the fire for the night. In the dim light, she watched as he spread his blanket on the plank floor, using his saddle as a pillow. His profile in the dying firelight was strong, the line of his jaw determined even in repose. "Good night, Sheriff," she said softly. "Vale," he replied, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "Out here, I think you can call me Vale." Katherine smiled into the darkness. "Good night, Vale." "Good night, Katherine." Her name on his lips sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. As she drifted towards sleep, lulled by the steady sound of rain on the roof and Vale's deep, even breathing, Katherine realized with a start that for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt completely safe. Morning came with clearing skies and sunlight streaming through the cabin's small window. Katherine woke to find Vale already up, stoking the fire and heating water for coffee. He'd put on his now dry shirt and vest, and his hair was damp, as if he'd just washed in the basin by the door. "Sleep well?" he asked, glancing up as she stirred. "Better than I expected," Katherine admitted, sitting up and running a hand through her tangled hair. She felt self-conscious in her state of undress, though her chemise and drawers covered more than many evening gowns she'd worn in Philadelphia. Vale seemed to sense her discomfort and turned his attention back to the coffee. "Your dress should be dry. I'll step outside while you dress." Once alone, Katherine quickly donned her clothes, grateful that the fabric was indeed dry. She couldn't help but smile at the thought of Vale's considerate nature. Most men of her acquaintance in Philadelphia would never have thought to build a fire before she woke, much less give her privacy in such close quarters. When Vale returned, he brought fresh water from a nearby stream. As they shared a breakfast of hard bread and dried fruit, he outlined their plan for the day. "We'll follow Raven Creek for another 10 miles, then cut southeast toward the Platte," he said. "There's a trading post at the confluence where we can resupply." The day's ride was pleasant, the air washed clean by the storm and the landscape vibrant with wildflowers that had sprung up overnight. Katherine found herself relaxing into the journey, her body beginning to adjust to the rhythm of riding. Vale pointed out tracks in the muddy trail, deer, coyote, the occasional bear, teaching her to read the signs of the wilderness around them. They made good time, reaching the trading post by mid-afternoon. Unlike Broken Pine, this was little more than a single rough-hewn building surrounded by a high palisade. The proprietor, a one-eyed man named Fletcher, greeted Vale with cautious respect. "Heard about that stage robbery," Fletcher said as he measured coffee beans into a paper sack. "Bad business that, Silas Redmond's work," Vale nodded grimly. "He got away, 3 of his men didn't," Fletcher whistled low. "He won't take that kindly." His good eye flicked to Katherine, who stood examining a display of calico fabric. "Traveling with company now, Sheriff." "Miss Greenwood was the only survivor of the attack," Vale said, his tone discouraging further questions. "I'm escorting her to Scottsbluff." Fletcher raised his eyebrows but said nothing more on the subject. Instead, he leaned closer to Vale. "Heard news from the north. Cavalry's pulled back from Fort Phil Kearny. Word is they're abandoning the Bozeman Trail entirely." Vale frowned. "Government giving in to Red Cloud's demands. Looks that way." Fletcher snorted. "About time they showed some sense. That trail was nothing but trouble from the start." As they prepared to leave, Fletcher suddenly grabbed Vale's arm. "Almost forgot. Ryder came through yesterday, headed east. Said to tell you if I saw you that Silas was spotted near Chimney Rock gathering men." Katherine, who had been waiting by the door, felt a chill run through her. Chimney Rock lay directly on their path to Scottsbluff. Outside, as Vale secured their newly purchased supplies to the horses, Katherine confronted him. "We're riding into danger, aren't we? This man, Silas, he'll be looking for us." Vale's jaw tightened. "Looking for me." "You're just an unfortunate complication." "Because you killed his men," Katherine stated. "Because I've been hunting him for months," Vale corrected. "The stagecoach wasn't his first robbery or even his 10th. He's wanted for murder in 3 territories. Katherine digested this information. "Should we change our route again? Avoid Chimney Rock?" Vale shook his head. "There's no good alternate route from here, not without adding weeks to our journey or heading back into hostile territory to the north." He met her eyes. "I won't lie to you, Katherine, the next few days will be dangerous. But I give you my word, I will get you safely to Scottsbluff." There was such conviction in his voice that Katherine found herself believing him implicitly. "I trust you," she said simply. The intensity of Vale's gaze made her breath catch. For a moment, it seemed he might say something more, but instead he helped her mount her horse, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. They rode in silence for several miles, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape grew more dramatic as they traveled, with sandstone formations rising from the plains like ancient sentinels. In the late afternoon, they made camp in a sheltered hollow beside a small tributary of the Platte. As Vale built a fire, Katherine unpacked their provisions, working alongside him with a growing sense of partnership that felt surprisingly natural. When their simple camp was established, Vale disappeared briefly, returning with 2 rabbits he'd snared. "Thought we could use a hot meal," he said, already setting to work cleaning them. Katherine watched, fascinated despite herself, as Vale prepared the rabbits with practiced efficiency. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My grandfather," Vale replied. "He was a trapper before he settled down to blacksmithing. Taught me how to live off the land when I was barely tall enough to hold a rifle." As they ate the rabbit stew Vale had prepared, sitting close beside the fire as the evening cooled around them, Katherine found herself studying his profile in the flickering light. "Why did you become a sheriff?" she asked suddenly. "After the war, you could have gone anywhere, done anything." Vale was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "During the war, I saw what men are capable of when law breaks down," he said finally. Both sides. It wasn't just the killing, it was the casual cruelty, the way men stopped seeing each other as human. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. When I came west, I saw the same thing happening here, men like Silas Redmond preying on the weak because they could. He looked at Katherine, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Someone has to stand against that. Might as well be me. The simple dignity in his words touched Katherine deeply. In Philadelphia, the men she'd known had been driven by ambition, by the pursuit of wealth and status. Vale Cunningham lived by a different code, entirely one of duty and justice that demanded more from him than it gave. "It's a lonely life," she observed softly, Vale's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "It has its moments." His gaze lingered on her face, and Katherine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her. That night, as they lay on opposite sides of the dying fire, Katherine found herself unable to sleep. The stars overhead were impossibly bright, the silence of the plains broken only by the occasional call of a night bird and the soft sound of Vale's breathing. Vale. She whispered, uncertain if he was still awake. "Yes." His voice came immediately, alert despite the late hour. Katherine hesitated, suddenly unsure what she wanted to say. "Thank you for everything." There was a pause, then Vale's reply, his voice low in the darkness. "You don't need to thank me, Katherine. Nevertheless, I am grateful." She pulled her blanket closer around her shoulders. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did." "You'd have found a way," Vale said with quiet certainty. "You're stronger than you know." His words settled over her like a benediction, and Katherine closed her eyes, a smile curving her lips as she drifted into sleep. The next few days fell into a rhythm. They would rise at dawn, break camp, and ride until midday, stopping briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold meal. Then they would continue until dusk, making camp in whatever sheltered spot Vale deemed suitable. Each night, they would sit by the fire, sharing stories of their lives and gradually revealing more of themselves to each other. Katherine told Vale about her mother's death when she was 12, her father's financial struggles, the broken engagement that had left her reputation tarnished in Philadelphia society. Vale spoke of his time with the Texas Rangers, the friends he'd lost in the war, his dreams of someday having a ranch of his own. "Why haven't you?" Katherine asked one evening. "Bought land, I mean. Surely after 5 years as sheriff you could have saved enough," Vale shrugged. "Never seemed the right time. Always one more criminal to catch, one more problem to solve," he smiled ruefully. "Besides, a ranch needs a woman's touch. My mother used to say a house without a woman is just walls and a roof, not a home." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. Katherine found herself imagining such a home, a solid house on a stretch of good land, with Vale returning at day's end to find her waiting. The vision was so vivid, so achingly appealing, that she had to look away before he saw the longing in her eyes. On the 4th day after leaving the trading post, they crested a rise to find Chimney Rock in the distance, its distinctive spire reaching toward the sky like a finger pointing to heaven. Vale reined in his horse, studying the landscape with narrowed eyes. "We'll approach from the south," he decided. "Less exposed that way." Katherine nodded, following his lead as they angled away from the main trail. They rode in silence, Vale's posture alert, his hand never far from the rifle slung across his saddle. The tension in his body communicated itself to Katherine, who found herself scanning the horizon for signs of danger. They had just entered a narrow draw between 2 low hills when the first shot rang out. Vale reacted instantly, pulling Katherine from her horse and pushing her behind a large boulder as more bullets kicked up dust around them. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his pistol and returning fire toward the ridgeline above them. Katherine pressed herself against the rock, heart hammering in her chest. The horses had bolted at the first shot, carrying their supplies with them. She could hear men shouting to each other, their voices carried on the wind. "Found you at last, Sheriff," a voice called, rough with malice. "Thought you were clever taking the southern route, but I know these hills better than you ever will." Vale's jaw tightened. "Silas," he muttered. He glanced at Katherine. I count 5 of them all on the ridge. We're pinned down here. What do we do? Katherine asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Vale checked his ammunition. They'll wait for dark, then try to flank us. We need to move before then. He peered around the boulder, ducking back as a bullet chipped stone inches from his head. There's a ravine about 50 yards back the way we came. If we can reach it, we might be able to circle around behind them. Katherine nodded, gathering her courage. Just tell me what to do. Vale's expression softened for a moment, his eyes filled with something that made Katherine's heart skip. When I give the word, run for that outcropping of rocks. He pointed to a pile of boulders about halfway to the ravine. I'll cover you. Once you're there, you cover me. With what? Katherine asked, suddenly remembering the derringer still tucked in her pocket. She pulled it out, showing it to Vale. He raised an eyebrow. 2 shots is better than none. He checked his pistol one more time. Ready? Katherine took a deep breath, nodding. Now. Vale shouted, standing and firing rapidly at the ridge. Katherine ran, her skirts gathered in one hand, the derringer clutched in the other. Bullets kicked up dirt at her feet, but she didn't stop until she reached the rocks, diving behind them as Vale had shown her. Once there, she peered out, aiming the tiny pistol toward the ridge where muzzle flashes betrayed the shooter's positions. Vale, now, she called, firing one precious shot toward the ridge. Vale sprinted toward her, moving in a zigzag pattern as bullets struck the ground around him. Just as he reached the rocks, Katherine saw him stumble, a bullet grazing his arm. He fell beside her, grimacing in pain. You're hit, she gasped, reaching for him. It's nothing, he grunted, already checking his wound. Just a graze. Blood seeped through his torn shirt sleeve, but the bullet had indeed only grazed the flesh of his upper arm. Katherine tore a strip from her petticoat, binding the wound quickly as Vale kept watch. The shooting had paused, and they could hear Silas's men conferring on the ridge. They're splitting up, Vale said grimly. Half staying on the ridge, half coming down to circle behind us. He glanced at the setting sun. We need to move now. Together, they made their way in short dashes from cover to cover, working their way toward the ravine. Just as they reached its edge, a shout from behind indicated they'd been spotted. Vale pushed Katherine down the steep slope, both of them half sliding, half running to the bottom as bullets whined overhead. The ravine was deeper than it had appeared from a distance, its bottom shadowed and cool. A trickle of water ran through its center, creating a narrow strip of mud. Vale pulled Katherine along its length, moving as quickly and silently as possible. If we follow this to the end, it should bring us out behind them, he whispered. Then we can double back, try to find the horses. They moved swiftly through the gathering dusk, the walls of the ravine rising high on either side. Katherine's skirts were torn and muddy, her hands scratched from catching herself on sharp rocks, but she pushed on without complaint. Vale's wound had stopped bleeding, but she could see the pain in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The ravine eventually widened and grew shallower, opening onto a flat area dotted with juniper and sage. Vale signaled for Katherine to wait as he crept forward, scouting their position. When he returned, his expression was grim. They've found the horses, he reported. 3 men guarding them near a stand of cottonwoods about half a mile east. Silas and another man are still searching the area we left. What do we do? Katherine asked, trying to ignore the growing knot of fear in her stomach. Vale considered their options. We need those horses and supplies if we're going to make it to Scottsbluff, but taking on 3 armed men, he shook his head. Too risky with just 1 pistol between us. Katherine touched his arm gently. Could we wait until dark? Perhaps they'll relax their guard. Vale nodded slowly. It's our best chance. We'll circle around, get as close as we can, then wait for an opportunity. As night fell, they crept toward the cottonwoods, using the growing darkness for cover. From their hidden position in a thicket of scrub oak, they could see the 3 men gathered around a small fire, the horses tethered nearby. Vale's stallion and Katherine's mare stood with heads lowered, seemingly unharmed. One of them is falling asleep, Katherine whispered, pointing to a burly man whose chin kept dropping to his chest. And that one hasn't stopped drinking since we've been watching. She indicated a second man who was passing a bottle back and forth with the third. Vale studied the scene. If we wait another hour, they may all be sleeping or drunk. Then I can try to get the horses. Katherine bit her lip. It's too dangerous for you to go alone. I don't see another option, Vale replied. Katherine was silent for a moment, thinking. Then, what if I create a distraction, draw their attention away from the horses? Vale immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. Listen to me, Katherine insisted. I still have one shot in my Derringer. I could fire it from that stand of trees to the west, make them think Silas is signaling them. While they're investigating, you get the horses. And if they catch you, Vale's voice was tight with concern. Katherine met his gaze steadily. They won't. Vale stared at her for a long moment, the struggle evident on his face. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. But at the first sign of trouble, you run. Promise me? I promise, Katherine said, though they both knew she was lying. They waited until the drinking men were visibly intoxicated and the third had dozed off completely. Then, with a final look at Vale, Katherine slipped away into the darkness, making her way carefully through the scrub toward the western stand of trees. The night was quiet, the only sounds the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant murmur of the outlaws' voices. Katherine moved as silently as she could, grateful for the dark color of her dress. When she reached the trees, she positioned herself behind the largest trunk, took a deep breath, and fired her last shot into the air. The reaction was immediate. All three men jumped to their feet, the sleeping one nearly falling over in his haste to stand. That's Silas's signal. One of them slurred. He must have found something. You two go check, the burliest one ordered. I'll stay with the horses. Katherine's heart sank as she watched two of the men stumble toward her position, leaving one guard behind. This wasn't the outcome she'd hoped for. She pressed herself against the tree, trying to control her breathing as the men approached, their curses growing louder as they struggled through the underbrush. She needed to move, to draw them farther from the camp. Gathering her courage, Katherine slipped from tree to tree, deliberately making just enough noise to keep the men following her. She led them on a winding path, gradually increasing the distance from the camp while staying within the relative safety of the trees. Back at the camp, Vale watched the guard left behind. The man paced nervously, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. Vale knew he couldn't wait much longer. The two men pursuing Katherine would soon realize they'd been tricked. Slipping his hunting knife from his boot, Vale crept toward the camp, using the horses themselves as cover. The guard had his back turned, still watching the direction his companions had gone. With practiced stealth, Vale approached from behind, clamping one hand over the man's mouth while pressing the knife to his throat. Make a sound and you die, Vale growled. Not if you understand, the guard nodded frantically, his eyes wide with fear. Drop the rifle, Vale ordered, slowly. The man complied, the weapon falling silently onto the soft ground. Vale kicked it away, then quickly bound the guard with his own belt and gagged him with a bandana. Working swiftly, he gathered their saddlebags and secured them to the horses. He was just mounting his stallion, Katherine's mare's reins in hand, when a woman's scream split the night. Katherine Vale spurred his horse toward the sound, leading the mare behind him. He found Katherine backed against a tree, one of the outlaws gripping her arm while the other leveled a pistol at her. Let her go, Vale shouted, drawing his own weapon. Both men whirled at the sound of his voice. Vale didn't hesitate. He fired twice in rapid succession. The first man fell immediately, a bullet in his chest. The second managed to get off a wild shot before Vale's second bullet found its mark. Katherine stood frozen, her face pale in the moonlight. Vale dismounted, crossing to her in 3 long strides. Are you hurt? He demanded, his hands gentle as they checked her for injuries. No, she whispered, her voice shaky. He grabbed me, but then you came. She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears of relief. Without thinking, Vale pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. Katherine clung to him, her body trembling. For a long moment they stood entwined, the danger around them temporarily forgotten in the sheer relief of finding each other safe. We need to go, Vale said finally, reluctantly releasing her. Silas will have heard the shots. They mounted quickly, Vale helping Katherine onto her mare before swinging up onto his stallion. They rode hard through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Silas Redmond's men. Vale set a punishing pace, pushing the horses to their limits until they'd crossed the Platte River and reached a series of bluffs that offered both shelter and a defensible position. Only then did they stop, the horses blowing hard, sides heaving with exertion. Vale helped Katherine dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. In the pale light of the rising moon, her face was smudged with dirt, her hair falling loose from its pins, yet Vale thought he'd never seen anyone more beautiful. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Katherine looked up at him, her eyes steady despite the ordeal they'd just endured. "So could you," she replied simply. Something broke in Vale than the careful control he'd maintained since finding her beside that overturned stagecoach days ago. He cupped her face in his hands, giving her every chance to pull away. Instead, Katherine leaned toward him, her lips parting slightly in invitation. Their first kiss was gentle, almost tentative, a question asked and answered in the press of lips. The second was deeper, more urgent, Vale's arms encircling Katherine's waist as her hands slid up to his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads touching as they stood close in the moonlight. "Katherine," Vale whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She smiled, fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I think I've been waiting for you to do that since Broken Pine," she admitted. Vale chuckled, the sound warm and rich in the quiet night. "I wanted to. God knows I wanted to." "What stopped you? You're a lady," Vale said simply. "And I'm just a frontier sheriff with nothing to offer but a dangerous life and uncertain future." Katherine shook her head, her expression serious. "You're the most honorable man I've ever known, Vale Cunningham, and I'd rather face an uncertain future with you than a comfortable one without you." Vale kissed her again, a brief, fierce claiming that left Katherine breathless. Then, remembering where they were, he reluctantly stepped back. "We should make camp, get some rest. We still have Silas to worry about, and we're at least 2 days from Scottsbluff." They established a simple camp in the shelter of the bluffs, Vale insisting on taking the first watch despite his exhaustion. Katherine fell asleep quickly, wrapped in her blanket near the small fire Vale had built. As he watched her sleeping face, peaceful despite all they'd been through, Vale felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. Whatever it took, he would get her safely to Scottsbluff, and then, perhaps, he'd finally have the courage to ask for more than just a kiss in the moonlight. The dawn came clear and cold, the landscape spread before them in shades of gold and amber as the sun rose over the plains. Vale, who had eventually allowed Katherine to take a watch so he could rest, was already awake, scanning their back trail for signs of pursuit. "Anything?" Katherine asked, coming to stand beside him, her hair neatly braided once more, her torn dress brushed as clean as possible. Vale shook his head. "Nothing yet, but Silas isn't one to give up easily. We should keep moving." They ate a quick breakfast of hard bread and jerky, then mounted up, continuing their journey east toward Scottsbluff. The terrain grew more rugged as they rode, the flat plains giving way to sandstone bluffs and deep ravines. Vale set a steady pace, balancing the need for speed with the necessity of preserving their horses' strength. By midday, they had reached a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of prairie. Vale drew rein, pointing to a distant smudge on the horizon. "Scottsbluff," he said. "We could make it by nightfall if we push hard." Katherine felt a conflicting surge of emotions, relief at being so close to their destination, but also a strange reluctance. Once they reached Scottsbluff, their journey together would end. Vale would report to the territorial marshal, and she would find her way to Thomas Elliott's home. The intimacy they'd shared on the trail, both physical and emotional, would be constrained by the conventions of town life. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly, "after you've delivered me safely?" Vale's eyes met hers, understanding the unspoken question. "I've been thinking about that," he said slowly. "My business with Silas isn't finished. The marshal will want to organize a proper posse to track him down. And after that," Katherine pressed, Vale's gaze was steady. After that, I thought I might look into land prices around Scottsbluff. I hear there's good grazing to the south." A smile bloomed on Catherine's face. "I've heard the same," she said softly. They might have said more, but a movement in the valley below caught Vale's attention. He stiffened, reaching for his spyglass. "Riders," he said grimly, "6 of them moving fast, and they're between us and Scottsbluff." Catherine's heart sank. "Sela's?" Vale nodded, collapsing the spyglass. "He must have ridden through the night, circled around ahead of us." He surveyed their position, thinking quickly. "We can't outrun them, not with our horses this tired, and we can't fight 6 men with just my pistol." "What can we do?" Katherine asked, fighting to keep the fear from her voice. Vale pointed to a narrow canyon cutting through the ridge to their right. "That leads to the old trapper's trail. It's rough going, but it might give us a chance to lose them in the broken country beyond." Without waiting for a response, Vale led the way toward the canyon entrance. The path narrowed quickly, barely wide enough for the horses to pass single file. Steep walls of red sandstone rose on either side, creating a natural corridor that wound deeper into the ridge. They had just reached a sharp bend in the canyon when the first gunshot echoed behind them. Vale cursed under his breath, urging his horse forward. "They found our trail." The canyon twisted and turned, eventually opening onto a landscape of hoodoos and balanced rocks, fantastic formations carved by wind and water over countless centuries. Vale led them through this maze of stone, choosing their path with the certainty of a man who had traveled this way before. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 3 miles ahead," he called back to Katherine. "If we can reach it before they catch us, we might have a chance." They rode hard, the horses straining up steep inclines and sliding down loose shale slopes. Behind them, the occasional shout or gunshot told them their pursuers were still on their trail. Vale pushed on relentlessly, his face set in grim determination. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled against a cliff face, its weathered logs almost the same color as the surrounding stone. Vale pulled up sharply, dismounting and helping Katherine down. "Get inside," he ordered, already unsaddling the exhausted horses. "There's a spring behind the cabin. The horses need water." Katherine hurried to help, carrying their saddlebags into the cabin while Vale tended to the animals. Inside, the single room was dusty but intact, a stone fireplace at one end, a rough-hewn table and chair, a narrow cot along one wall. A small window offered a view of the approach to the cabin. Vale joined her moments later, barring the door behind him. "They're still coming," he said grimly, checking his ammunition. "Maybe 10 minutes behind us." Katherine set her jaw, determined not to give in to fear. "What's the plan?" Vale's eyes met hers, filled with a quiet resolve that steadied her nerves. "We make a stand here. The cabin walls are thick enough to stop bullets. There's only one door, and I can cover the window." He moved to the fireplace, pulling loose stones from the back wall to reveal a hidden cache. From it, he drew an old but well-maintained rifle and a box of ammunition. "You've been here before," Katherine observed. Vale nodded, loading the rifle with practiced efficiency. "This was a ranger's safe house during the war. I helped establish it." He handed her his pistol. "You know how to use this." Katherine took the weapon, checking it as Vale had taught her during their journey. "Yes." Vale's expression softened for a moment. "Katherine, if anything happens to me," she shook her head fiercely. "Don't. We will get through this, Vale Cunningham, together." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, madam." They positioned themselves on either side of the cabin, Vale at the window, Katherine near the door. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rocky ground, creating a constantly shifting pattern that made it difficult to distinguish movement from shadow. The first rider appeared at the edge of the clearing, reining in his horse sharply when he spotted the cabin. Vale raised the rifle but didn't fire. "Wait," he murmured. "Let them come closer." 5 more riders joined the first, spreading out in a semicircle before the cabin. One man, taller than the others with a shock of white blonde hair visible beneath his hat, urged his horse forward a few paces. "Vale Cunningham," he shouted. "I know you're in there. Come out now and I might let the woman live." "That's Sela's," Vale said quietly to Katherine. "Don't believe a word he says." Katherine nodded grimly, gripping the pistol tighter. Vale called back through the window, "It's over, Silas. The marshal in Scottsbluff knows all about you. There's a posse on the way even now." Silas laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet afternoon. "Nice try, Sheriff, but we both know you're alone out here." He signaled to his men, who began to dismount. "We've got all the time in the world." One of the outlaws moved toward the spring behind the cabin. Vale tracked him through the window, then fired. The man fell with a cry, clutching his leg. The others immediately dove for cover, returning fire that splintered the window frame and thudded into the thick log walls. "That'll keep them honest for a while," Vale said, reloading quickly. The standoff continued as the sun began to set, casting the clearing in deepening shadow. The outlaws fired occasionally, more to keep Vale and Katherine pinned down than with any real hope of hitting them. Vale responded sparingly, conserving ammunition. As darkness fell, Katherine moved closer to Vale. "What are they waiting for?" she whispered. "Night," Vale replied grimly. "They'll try to rush us once it's fully dark." Katherine shivered despite the warmth of the cabin. "We can't hold them off forever." Vale turned to her, his face half in shadow. "No," he agreed softly, "but we can make it cost them dearly." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket, drawing out a small object that glinted in the fading light. "Katherine, there's something I want you to have." "Something I've been carrying since Broken Pine." He placed a simple gold ring in her palm, a band engraved with a pattern of leaves and flowers. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've kept it with me all these years, waiting for." He trailed off, then met her eyes directly. "Waiting for you, though I didn't know it until now." Katherine stared at the ring, then at Vale's face, her heart swelling with emotion. "Vale, are you asking?" A shout from outside interrupted her. "Sheriff, last chance to surrender." Vale moved back to the window, rifle ready. "Think about it," he said over his shoulder, his voice deliberately light despite the tension in his body. "If we survive this, I'll ask you properly." Katherine slipped the ring onto her finger, its weight unfamiliar but somehow right. "When we survive this," she corrected, moving to take up her position by the door once more. The attack, when it came, was from all sides at once. Two men rushed the door while others provided covering fire from the edges of the clearing. Vale shot the first man through the window, then turned to help Katherine as the door shuddered under the impact of a shoulder or boot. Katherine aimed the pistol at the door, ready to fire the moment it gave way. But instead of splintering, the door suddenly stopped shaking. Outside, shouts of confusion replaced the battle cries of moments before. Then, incredibly, gunfire but not directed at the cabin. "What's happening?" Katherine asked, bewildered. Vale moved cautiously to the window, peering out into the darkness. After a moment, he let out a surprised laugh. "Reinforcements," he said. "And unless I'm mistaken, that's Marshal Davis leading them." Katherine joined him at the window. In the faint moonlight, she could make out several riders at the edge of the clearing, exchanging fire with Silas's men, who were now in full retreat. One figure broke away from the newcomers, approaching the cabin cautiously. "Vale Cunningham, you still alive in there?" Vale unbarred the door, opening it just enough to call back. "Still breathing, Marshal. Got a lady with me." The Marshal approached, his weathered face becoming visible as he stepped into the patch of moonlight before the cabin. "Figured as much when Fletcher told me you were escorting a survivor from the stagecoach robbery. Been following your trail since Broken Pine." Vale opened the door fully, ushering Katherine outside with him. "Silas Redmond's behind the robbery," he explained quickly. "He's the one with the white blonde hair." The Marshal nodded grimly. "I know Silas, been after him for a year now." He turned, shouting orders to his men who were already mounting up to pursue the fleeing outlaws. "We'll get him this time," he assured Vale. "You two all right?" Vale glanced at Katherine, who stood tall beside him despite her torn dress and exhausted state. "We're fine," he said, his hand finding hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining. "Just eager to reach Scottsbluff." The Marshal nodded. "My men will handle Silas. I'll escort you both to town myself." The ride to Scottsbluff the next morning was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the previous days. The Marshal rode ahead, with Vale and Katherine following side by side, their horses refreshed after a night's rest. News had already reached them at breakfast that Silas Redmond had been captured, along with 2 of his remaining men. The others had been killed in the firefight or subsequent chase. As they crested the last rise and Scottsbluff came into full view, a growing frontier town spread along the banks of the North Platte River, Katherine felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension. Their journey was ending, but what lay ahead remained uncertain. "Penny for your thoughts," Vale said, guiding his horse closer to hers. Katherine smiled. "I was just thinking about how different everything looks in the light of day," Vale nodded, understanding her meaning. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly, his eyes on the town below. Katherine followed his gaze to Scottsbluff, seeing not just the collection of buildings and streets, but possibilities of future that hadn't existed for her a week ago. "No," she said firmly, "no second thoughts." She held up her hand where his mother's ring caught the sunlight. "Though I do believe you promised me a proper proposal when we survived." Vale's face broke into a grin that transformed him, erasing the lines of worry and hardship that had been his constant companions during their journey. He reined his horse to a stop, prompting Katherine to do the same. The marshal, noticing they'd fallen behind, paused a respectful distance ahead, his back turned to give them privacy. Vale dismounted, then lifted Katherine from her saddle, setting her gently on the ground before him. To her surprise, he knelt on one knee in the dust of the trail, still holding her hands in his. "Katherine Greenwood," he began, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "A week ago, I found you beside a wrecked stagecoach, and my life hasn't been the same since. You are the bravest, most determined woman I've ever known. You faced down bandits, survived in the wilderness, and never once complained about the hardships of the trail." He paused, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "I know it's fast, I know we've only just met. But out here, life doesn't wait for proper courtships and lengthy engagements. When you find something worth holding on to, you grab it with both hands." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Katherine. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Katherine's vision as she looked down at this man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Vale Cunningham, I will marry you." Vale stood, lifting her off her feet in a jubilant embrace, spinning her around once before setting her back on the ground and kissing her thoroughly. The marshal's discreet cough eventually broke them apart, both laughing like children. "If you two are quite finished," the marshal called, a smile evident in his voice, "there's a town waiting down there." They remounted, riding the last mile to Scottsbluff with hands clasped between them whenever the trail allowed. The town was bustling with activity, freight wagons loaded with supplies for the railroad construction, cowboys leading horses to the livery stable, women in calico dresses carrying baskets of shopping or laundry. The marshal led them to the sheriff's office, a solid building on the main street. Inside, he took Vale's official statement about the stagecoach robbery and the subsequent events, while Katherine waited, watching the townspeople pass by the window. When they finished, Vale joined her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. "I need to send a telegram to Broken Pine, let them know what happened," he explained. "Then we should find your uncle, your father's friend." Katherine nodded, suddenly remembering the purpose that had brought her to Scottsbluff in the first place. Thomas Elliott's store should be on the main street, according to his letters. They found it easily enough. Elliott's Dry Goods, a prosperous-looking establishment with large display windows filled with practical frontier necessities and a few modest luxuries. Inside, a balding man in his 50s looked up from behind the counter, his expression changing from polite inquiry to shock as he recognized Katherine. "Miss Greenwood, I'd nearly given up hope of your arrival. The stage was due 3 days ago, and when word came of a robbery." He hurried around the counter, taking Katherine's hands in his. "My dear, I am so relieved to see you safe." Katherine introduced Vale, explaining briefly what had happened. Thomas Elliott listened with growing concern, his eyes widening at the tale of their narrow escape. "You've been through a terrible ordeal," he said when they finished. My home is just behind the store. My wife will be delighted to see you. She's been preparing the guest room for weeks." Katherine glanced at Vale, suddenly uncertain. They hadn't discussed what would happen after reaching town beyond Vale's proposal. Would he expect her to stay with the Elliots as originally planned, or was there another option? Vale seemed to read her thoughts. "Mr. Elliot, I appreciate your hospitality toward Miss Greenwood. However, circumstances have changed somewhat during our journey." He took Katherine's hand, where his mother's ring glinted in the store's lamplight. "Katherine has done me the honor of agreeing to become my wife." Thomas Elliott's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Well, this is unexpected but delightful news." He smiled warmly at Katherine. "Your father would be pleased, I think, to know you've found happiness here." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of her father. "I believe he would," she agreed softly. "Of course, you're both welcome to stay with us until wedding arrangements can be made," Elliot continued. "My wife will be thrilled to help with the preparations." Vale thanked him but explained that he needed to remain in town for several days to complete his official business with the territorial marshal. "But I would be grateful if Katherine could stay with you," he added. "It would ease my mind to know she's safe and comfortable." Later, after Vale had left to find accommodations at the town's hotel, Mrs. Elliot showed Katherine to the guest room, a small but cheerful space with flowered curtains and a real feather bed. The older woman fussed over Katherine, insisting she rest while a bath was prepared and a hot meal cooked. Alone at last, Katherine sat on the edge of the bed, turning Vale's ring on her finger. So much had changed in just a week. She had left Philadelphia a desperate woman, fleeing creditors and scandal with only the jewels sewn into her dress as security. Now she was engaged to be married to a man she barely knew, yet knew better, perhaps, than anyone else in her life. The whirlwind courtship should have frightened her. Instead, Katherine felt a deep certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged. Vale had seen her at her worst, dirty, frightened, fighting for survival, and had loved her for her strength rather than despite it. In him, she had found not just protection but partnership. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Elliot entered, carrying a small bundle. "I thought you might appreciate some fresh clothes," she said, laying the bundle on the bed. "These belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Denver. You're about the same size." Katherine thanked her sincerely. As Mrs. Elliot turned to leave, Katherine called her back. "Mrs. Elliot, I wonder if you might help me with something else. I have some items I need to sell." She hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. "Jewels that belonged to my mother. They're all I have left of my family's fortune." Mrs. Elliot's kind face showed no judgment. "Of course, my dear. My husband knows a reputable jeweler in town. He's always fair in his assessments." 2 days later, Katherine stood in Elliot's dry goods, studying a plot of land marked on a map spread across the counter. Vale stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers as he pointed out features of the property. "It's good grazing land with a creek running through the north section. The previous owner built a small cabin here," he indicated a spot near a stand of trees, "but there's room for a proper house overlooking the valley." Thomas Elliot nodded approvingly. "It's prime land, Vale. You're getting it at a fair price, too. Peterson's eager to sell now that the railroad's coming through." Katherine traced the boundaries of what would soon be their home. The sale of her mother's jewels had yielded more than she'd expected, enough to purchase the land outright and still have capital remaining to build a house and buy cattle to start their ranch. "It's perfect," she said softly. Vale's hand covered hers on the map, warm and reassuring. "You're sure about this? It won't be an easy life, especially at first." Katherine smiled up at him. "The trail was too dangerous to cross alone," she reminded him, echoing his words from their first meeting. "But I'm not alone anymore." Vale's eyes darkened with emotion. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above his mother's ring. "No," he agreed, "you're not alone anymore." The wedding took place 2 weeks later in Scottsbluff's small church. It was a simple ceremony, attended by the Elliots, Marshal Davis, and a few townspeople who had quickly become friends. Katherine wore a dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Elliot had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had been salvaged from her torn Philadelphia gown. Vale, looking uncommonly handsome in a new black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. Their vows were brief but heartfelt, spoken with the straightforward honesty that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Vale's kiss was both tender and possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. The small reception at the Elliott home was cheerful, with good food, better whiskey, and genuine warmth from the community that had so quickly accepted them both. As the evening drew to a close, Vale led Katherine outside to where a wagon waited, loaded with supplies for their new home. "Ready, Mrs. Cunningham?" he asked, helping her onto the seat. Katherine smiled, leaning into his side as he took the reins. "Ready, Sheriff Cunningham." They drove through the gathering dusk, following the river south toward their land. The first stars were appearing overhead, bright in the clear autumn sky. Katherine nestled closer to Vale, his arms strong around her shoulders. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her temple. Katherine looked up at the man who had saved her life, who had shown her strength she hadn't known she possessed, who had offered her not just safety but a true partnership. "Not one," she replied, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw, "though I am curious about one thing." "What's that?" "What made you stop that day? When you found me beside the stage coach, you could have just tracked the bandits, left me to fend for myself." Vale was quiet for a moment, considering. "When I saw you standing there covered in dust, bleeding, but with your chin up and that tiny derringer in your hand, I knew you were something special." He smiled down at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "The trail was too dangerous for you to cross alone, but the truth is, I think my life would have been a lot more dangerous without you in it." Katherine laughed softly, understanding exactly what he meant. Without each other, they would have survived, but merely surviving was no longer enough for either of them. Together, they had found something worth fighting for, worth building, worth protecting. As their wagon crested the final hill and their land spread before them in the moonlight, Katherine felt a sense of homecoming stronger than anything she'd experienced in Philadelphia. The small cabin was just visible in the distance, a square of darker shadow against the silver-washed landscape. "Home," Vale said simply, urging the horses forward. Katherine squeezed his hand. "Home," she agreed. And as they drove toward their future together, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that while the trail had indeed been too dangerous to cross alone, finding Vale Cunningham had been worth every hardship and every danger. For in him, she had found not just safety, but the truest form of love one forged in adversity, tested by fire and strengthened by the shared determination to build something lasting in this wild and beautiful land they would now call home.